The deep, quiet hours of early morning settle over our room like an uninvited layer of fine chalk, casting a cold metallic light over a landscape that feels perpetually incomplete. We sit perched on the edge of a hard stool, our shoulders hunched forward, breathing in an air that tastes strangely dry, sterile, and laden with a background scent of industrial dust. If we look down at our immediate perimeter, we see that our nightstand has been turned into a miniature clinical library, a dense, heavy stack of self-help manuals, trauma healing guides, nervous system optimization handbooks, and psychological diagnostic manuals, their covers worn thin and edges bent from months of desperate, midnight reading. We have spent hours highlight-lining sentences about our childhood attachment styles, taking digital tests to categorize our defensive reflexes, and tracing our daily anxieties back to primitive wounds that occurred decades before this moment. Yet, despite this massive accumulation of therapeutic vocabulary, a deep, pervasive ache of absolute insufficiency continues to vibrate behind our sternum. We feel as though we are standing in a courtroom where we are perpetually being weighed, measured, and found wanting by an invisible judge. We are fully dressed, our hearts are beating, and our lungs are taking in air, but we are refusing to step out into the sunlight of our own lives, because a quiet, tyrannical voice inside our head whispers that we are still too broken, too unaligned, and too profoundly unhealed to deserve the open space of the world. We are a generation that has institutionalized the sickness of the therapeutic panopticon, transforming our hard-won self-awareness into an industrial weapon against our own immediate peace. We no longer look at our emotional eccentricities, our transient sadness, or our occasional creative blocks as normal human architecture to be navigated with a gentle hand. Instead, we treat our entire personality as a massive, complex clinical pathology that must be aggressively cured before our real existence can begin. We have fallen into a collective neurosis that demands we place our actual physical lives on a permanent pause loop while we wait for a hypothetical sanitized future when we are completely optimized, perfectly integrated, and entirely free from shadow. We tell ourselves that we will launch that creative business, write that raw book, or surrender our hearts to a real, vulnerable lover just as soon as we finish this next online retreat, resolve this specific childhood knot, or complete another 3 months of somatic tracking. We have turned healing into an endless, multi-layered obstacle course, converting the beautiful, unconditioned terrain of our life into a perpetual waiting room where our joy is kept hostage to a finish line that shifts the farther into the horizon with every book we open. The profound, suffocating absurdity of this internal delay is that we are living our entire existence as the starved, exhausted architect of an infinite renovation project. If we pull back the plastic tarps of our current narrative, we see that we have been granted an extraordinary inheritance. We are the legal owners of a magnificent, historic estate that stands on a high cliff face, offering a sweeping, breathtaking view of a wide-open valley. The structural bones of this house are solid, the fireplaces are deep, and the cellars are stocked with rich wine meant to be shared in the light of an open flame. Yet, we refuse to inhabit the rooms. We spend decades living in a tiny, freezing and damp corner of the dark basement, breathing in the grey dust of scraped plaster, surrounded by industrial refuse bags, exposed wiring, and blinding blueprint sheets. We refuse to light a single fire in the hearth, we refuse to open the wine, and we refuse to invite our friends over to share a warm meal because we are terrified that someone will look past our shoulder and notice an unpainted patch of drywall in an upstairs hallway or a cracked tile in a bathroom we don't even use. We choose to freeze in the dark, starving ourselves of connection and vitality because we believe that our house must be mathematically flawless before it is worthy of being filled with human laughter. Let us trace the terrifying, cold velocity of this optimization trap through our daily micro-choices. We see it when we look at our creative projects, lying dead and abandoned in digital folders because we believe our voice isn't sufficiently clear of egoic static to be expressed. We see it in our relationships where we hold our lovers at an icy, analytical distance, continuously running compatibility tests and analyzing their communication styles through a clinical lens, refusing to let our hearts break open into the raw, unscripted mess of real intimacy because we are waiting for a partnership that contains zero triggers. We have turned our healing journey into a sophisticated method of high-level hiding. By keeping ourselves perpetually in the status of a project under repair, we construct a magnificent, ironclad defense mechanism against the terrifying vulnerability of being seen, judged, or rejected by the world. We can tell ourselves, "I am not hiding because I am afraid I am simply staying in the basement, because my renovation isn't finished yet." We make ourselves the eternal patient, wrapping our skin in the sterile bandages of psychological analysis so tightly that our real, wild, and spontaneous nature forgets how to make a single move without checking a manual. The deep tragedy of this collective haunting is that the therapeutic mind is structurally designed to ensure that the renovation project can never, under any circumstances, be completed. The analytical intellect is a machine that operates through division, and contrast its entire function is to search for errors, to look for fractures, and to find the missing piece in the puzzle. The more we train our awareness to scan our interior landscape for hidden trauma, the more trauma the mind will invent to justify its own diagnostic machinery. We enter a self-perpetuating, multi-billion-dollar feedback loop of perpetual preparation, where every layer of darkness we unearth simply reveals 3 more layers of subconscious material that need to be cleared, integrated, or reparented. We are trying to clean a mud floor by scraping it with an iron shovel, completely blind to the reality that the tool we are using to achieve cleanliness is the exact thing that keeps the dirt permanently stirred up. We are holding our breath, waiting for a state of psychological sterility that does not exist in nature, entirely unaware that while we are down in the basement meticulously measuring our flaws against an impossible blueprint, the brilliant, unrepeatable miracle of our ordinary human day is turning into dust right before our eyes. To accurately trace how this endless blueprint of repair structurally organizes our physical existence, we must examine an archetype that has become the dominant psychological landscape of the modern, highly conscious seeker, figure of the hyper-vigilant patient, the perpetual student of emotional renovation. This is the version of us that has transformed the noble pursuit of healing into a sophisticated, permanent survival strategy. On the surface, this individual appears exceptionally wise, emotionally literate, and deeply committed to self-evolution. They are the ones who can dissect their relational dynamics with clinical precision, trace their current anxieties back to specific developmental milestones, and articulate their internal boundaries using the latest terminology of somatic therapy. They are often praised by their peers as paragons of self-awareness, held up as models of what it means to actively do the work of internal clearing. But if we descend past this articulate, highly educated surface and enter the private, frozen theater of their interior life, we find a human spirit that is completely locked in a state of chronic, agonizing self-withholding. The hyper-vigilant patient is not using healing to step into the world. They are using healing as an ornate shield to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of actual engagement. They live under an unexamined, subterranean belief that states, "If I remain a work in progress, if I keep myself wrapped in the safety of the diagnostic basement, I am permanently protected from the messy, unscripted risks of failure, rejection, or abandonment." They treat their actual life as a performance that is perpetually stuck in technical rehearsals, refusing to step onto the stage, under the full glare of the lights until they can guarantee that every psychological knot has been mathematically dissolved. They spend decades analyzing the composition of the water, entirely blind to the reality that they are drying out on the shore, using the very tools of liberation to construct an ironclad fortress of perpetual preparation. While the conscious intellect is busy framing this continuous delay as a sign of high integrity or deep spiritual devotion, our physical body is keeping a remarkably precise, painful record of the immense structural strain required to maintain this posture of non-arrival. The body does not understand the narrative of future healing. It only knows the raw, immediate contraction required to hold back a wave of vital energy. When we perform a detailed somatic mapping of the hypervigilant patient, we see that the fantasy of the finished self has physically engineered our muscles to hold our breath until we become perfect. The primary center of this physical deformation can be felt directly within our throat, around the vocal cords and the thyroid center. If we bring our awareness to the alignment of our neck right now, we can feel a persistent, tight knot of containment and muscular constriction that locks the laryngeal muscles into a state of permanent, defensive braking. This is the physical holding of a song that is waiting for an absolute permission slip to be sung. Our voice is chronically held back, overmodulated, or pushed down into a narrow, sanitized register because we are terrified that if we speak from our raw, unoptimized center, the world will hear our confusion, our anger, or our basic human messiness. We are literally choking out our own spontaneous truth, clamping our throat shut against our own wild, uncalibrated reality to maintain the appearance of the perfectly aligned student, while the explosive, creative life force within us is suffocated before it can ever touch the air. From the throat, this current of structural bracing travels downward and clamps with immense force directly into our diaphragm and the lateral expansion of our ribcage. When we live as a permanent renovation project, our breathing pattern is forced to adapt to a state of chronic, high-level hypervigilance. If we observe our breath in this exact second, we will notice that our lower ribs are held in a tight, defensive corset that prevents them from expanding sideways or moving fluidly with the natural tide of the lungs. We are structurally bracing our torso as if we are trying to squeeze our human nature into a rigid, military blueprint of alignment. This chronic diaphragmatic contraction keeps our nervous system permanently suspended in a state of low-grade, sympathetic fight-or-flight, ensuring that our thoughts remain frantic, analytical, and obsessed with error detection, creating the very anxiety we are trying to cure and ensuring that the basement of repair remains our only comfortable home. The most paralyzing and hidden manifestation of this somatic freezing is localized deep within our hips and the sacral center, where the body controls our ability to move through the unscripted chaos of a real human day. When we fall into the trap of the infinite renovation project, our pelvic floor and lower spine are held in a rigid, overcorrected alignment that mimics the clean, dead geometry of an architectural drawing. We refuse to let our hips sway. We refuse to let our spine drop into its natural asymmetrical curve, and we refuse to move with the loose, unpredictable rhythm of an animal. This physical rigidity is the somatic expression of our deep refusal of life's messiness. We are holding our lower body in a state of permanent arrest, a physical containment that makes every step into an unpredictable relationship, a creative risk, or an unscripted conversation feel like a terrifying plunge into a dark abyss. We are literally locking our bones to keep ourselves from making a single mistake, choosing the clean, sterile safety of a permanent blueprint over the muddy, ecstatic reality of a fully lived day. This systemic physical tightening feeds directly back into a toxic, self-perpetuating psychological feedback loop that grows more sophisticated with every book we read and every retreat we attend. Because we have linked our right to fully inhabit the world, to our psychological cleanliness. The analytical mind begins to treat our natural human flaws as structural defects that disqualify us from receiving love or expressing power in the present hour. The moment we feel a wave of ordinary anger, a flash of irrational jealousy, or a sudden dip into creative self-doubt, the inner judge instantly flags these experiences as proof that our renovation project is still incomplete. The mind whispers, "See, you are still too reactive. Your inner child is still unintegrated. You must go back down into the basement and complete another round of clearing before you are allowed to speak." To escape the shame of this perceived failure, we subconsciously sabotage our own expansion, withdrawing from the very relationships that could heal us, postponing the projects that could liberate us, and hiding our true faces behind a thick lacquer of therapeutic perfectionism. We are actively punishing ourselves for the crime of being human, sacrificing the brilliant, raw, and unrepeatable currency of our current days to maintain an illusion of sanitization, completely blind to the reality that there is no finished version of us waiting at the end of the therapeutic rainbow, and that the only self we will ever have is the beautifully cracked, unfinished and living sculpture that is breathing in this very room right now. To slice cleanly through this intricate, self-perpetuating fortress of permanent delay, we must bring the razor-sharp, cool surgical steel of the Buddha's insight directly into our internal blueprint office, using it to dismantle the absolute illusion that our human imperfections are structural defects disqualifying us from life. 2,500 years ago, standing on the raw, unpolished earth, a human being looked deeply into the cross-currents of human bondage and mapped the exact mechanical trap where our search for perfection becomes the ultimate architect of our suffering. He did not diagnose our psychological scars or our unintegrated shadows as a clinical pathology to be hidden away until cured. He exposed our refusal to live inside our unfinished nature as the primary engine of dukkha. When we look into our interior landscape and notice the inherent asymmetry of our human conditioning, the residual pocket of childhood anxiety that flares up on a random Thursday, the sudden wave of creative self-doubt that hits us before a launch, or the protective reflex that tightens our chest when intimacy gets too close, we are being struck by the first arrow of reality. This first arrow is the natural, unalterable consequence of having an ego, a history, and a relative form on this earth. It is the simple truth of impermanence, anicca, expressing itself through the fluid weather patterns of our psychological anatomy. No human being walks through this world with a completely flat, sanitized, and permanently aligned emotional surface. The great historical masters, the artists, the innovators, and the healers who shaped our world did not possess a pristine interior architecture. Free of cracks, they carried their scars, their eccentricities, and their deep-seated sensitivities directly into the fire of their work. The first arrow is neutral. It is the raw data of a living, breathing human psyche navigating a complex universe. But the modern therapeutic mind, completely possessed by the fantasy of the finished self, refuses to let this raw data be neutral. The moment a wave of natural anxiety or reactivity surfaces in our awareness, we reach back into our internal quiver, pull out a second arrow, and drive it with immense, screaming violence directly into the exact spot where the first arrow landed. This second arrow is the aggressive, unexamined internal verdict that declares, because you still feel insecure in this relationship, you are a broken machine. Because your inner child is not perfectly reparented, you are disqualified from launching your business or speaking your truth. You must go back down into the basement of repair and hide your face behind the plastic tarps until you are a perfect, clean circle of light. If we look closely at our existence right now, we will see that the profound exhaustion breaking our spirit is never caused by the actual presence of our flaws. It is entirely manufactured by the devastating infection of this second arrow. The first arrow is the asymmetry of being human. The second arrow is the arrogant, perfectionist belief that we must become a sterile, disembodied machine before we are allowed to touch the world. We turn a perfectly workable, authentic moment into a private exile. Sitting in our own rooms while our minds violently whip us for failing to achieve a state of psychological sanitization that does not exist anywhere in nature. To shatter the very foundation of this second arrow, the Buddha's wisdom requires us to look directly into the nature of the entity we are trying so desperately to renovate. The concept of the permanent, fixed self, the illusion he completely deconstructed through the realization of anatta. The hyper-vigilant patient operates under the false assumption that the self is a static, physical object, like an old kitchen cabinet or a brick wall, that can be systematically scraped, sanded, leveled and permanently dusted until it reaches an ultimate state of flawless execution. We believe that if we do enough therapy, read enough manuals, and track enough somatic cues, we will eventually cross a mythical finish line where our personality becomes a completed, unshakable monument of absolute alignment. But wisdom points to a completely different, liberating reality. There is no solid, static self waiting to be finished at the end of the therapeutic rainbow. The self is not a fixed object. It is an ever-changing, fluid weather pattern, continuous stream of sensations, thoughts, memories and reactions rolling through our awareness. Trying to achieve a finished self is like an architect trying to build a permanent monument out of smoke, or a traveler trying to tie a knot in a passing river. The more you try to sand down the edges of this fluid stream, the more edges the river will create, turning your healing journey into an infinite, exhausting loop of chasing your own shadow. The moment we break through this illusion, an immense, breathtaking space opens up in the very center of our chest. We look at our anxieties, our unhealed wounds, and our psychological cracks, and we realize a profound truth. The awareness that witnesses the flaw is already whole. The baseline consciousness that is currently listening to these words. The space that notices the tightness in your throat or the knot in your diaphragm has never been broken, has never been traumatized, and has never been incomplete. The sky does not need to renovate the storm clouds before it allows them to pass through its expanse. The ocean does not need to flatten its waves before it can mirror the light of the sun. When we shift our identity from the fluid, unfinished weather of our personality to the vast empty sky of our fundamental awareness, the violent compulsion to repair ourselves before we live completely evaporates. We see that we do not need to wait for the infinite renovation project to end before we can invite the world into our palace. We can throw open the heavy wooden doors of our estate, light a roaring fire in the hearth, open the oldest bottle of wine in the cellar, and invite our friends over to share a magnificent feast right now. In this very hour, while the drywall dust is still falling in the upstairs hallway, we see that our worthiness is not a variable score to be earned through psychological compliance, but an absolute, unconditioned reality that belongs to us by right of birth. We stop acting as the eternal patient hiding behind sterile bandages, and we step onto the damp, raw earth with our scars fully visible, our spine straight, and our heart unshielded, ready to live, to love, and to create out of the fierce, ecstatic realization that we are already entirely complete in our beautiful unfinishedness. To transition from the intellectual release of our perfectionist illusions into a lived, cellular liberation, we must enter the raw physical construction site of our own somatic architecture. We cannot dismantle the fantasy of the finished self through the same analytical intellect that has spent years managing our internal delay. For the mind is the very engine that draws the blueprints, schedules the repairs, and orders us back into the basement of unworthiness. The poison of psychological perfectionism is written in the dense, silent language of our muscles, manifesting as a persistent, tight knot of containment at our thyroid center, a structural bracing across our diaphragm, and a rigid, military alignment that locks our lower spine. To rewrite this programming, we must bring the steady, warm laser of our embodied presence directly into the physical coordinates where these defensive reflexes are anchored. This architecture of transformation requires us to master 3 distinct, daily inner practices that allow us to unlock the thyroid center, gather our fragmented parts in a sacred feast of flaws, and cultivate the art of radical inhabitation within our beautifully unfinished lives. The first foundational pillar of this real-world training is the systematic practice of unlocking the thyroid center and releasing the unmodulated voice. Because the hyper-vigilant patient archetype has spent years pulling our vocal cords into a tight, defensive chokehold holding back our natural pitch. Because we are terrified that the world will hear our confusion, our anxiety, or our basic human messiness, we must perform a direct somatic intervention to return our throat to its organic, unbuttoned state. We engage this practice whenever we feel that familiar, dry tightness rising in our neck, or when we notice ourselves over-modulating our speech, carefully filtering our sentences through a clinical lens before allowing them to pass our lips. We begin by sitting perfectly upright, allowing our spine to rest loosely in its natural vertical axis. We close our eyes and drop our awareness directly into the hollow of our throat, right behind the thyroid gland, visualizing this space not as a narrow tube under lock and key, but as a wide open cavern through which the wind can move without friction. We let our lower jaw drop completely down, creating a wide space between our upper and lower teeth, and we relax the root of our tongue until it spreads out like a soft, heavy leaf on the floor of the mouth. We take a long, deep inhalation through the nose, drawing the breath down into the very bottom of our lungs, and then, on a completely unedited, unoptimized exhalation, we let out a raw vocal sigh. We do not try to make the sound beautiful. We do not try to make it spiritual. And we do not try to align it with any therapeutic standard. We simply let whatever sound is currently living in our chest drop out into the room, whether it is a low grunt of exhaustion, a shaky vibration of fear, or a raw, unpolished note of grief. As the sound escapes, we feel the muscular armor around our larynx dissolve, recognizing that our voice does not need to be perfectly healed before it has a right to vibrate in the open air. This vocal opening provides the deep, spacious grounding required for our second discipline, the sacred gathering in the scaffolding, or what we call the Feast of Flaws. This is a powerful meditative visualization that we perform in the middle of our chaotic days, designed to actively dismantle the second arrow of psychological perfectionism by turning our internal boardroom into a sanctuary of total radical inclusion. Once every evening, preferably when the room is dark and the analytical mind is too tired to maintain its defenses, we sit comfortably on the floor and bring our awareness into the center of our chest. We mentally step out of the damp basement of endless repair, walk up the stairs of our historic estate, and enter the grand dining hall of our unfinished life. We look around the space and explicitly acknowledge the reality of the construction site. The scaffolding is still standing against the high walls, the plastic dust sheets are still rustling in the wind, and the fine white powder of unfinished drywall is still falling through the air. Instead of sweeping the floor or ordering everyone out until the repairs are done, we throw open the heavy wooden doors and invite our messiest, most unintegrated, and most unappealing psychological parts to enter the room as honored guests. We watch them walk into the light of the fireplace. We invite our raw, irrational Thursday anxiety to take a seat. We offer a chair to our old childish insecurity that is terrified of being abandoned. We welcome our messy, unaligned anger that we have spent years trying to meditate away, and we place a plate in front of our bitter, creative self-doubt. We look at these fragmented parts not as clinical defects to be pathologized and cured, but as the tired, ragged, and deeply human travelers who have carried us through the storms of our history. We pour them a glass of wine, we look into their terrified eyes, and we say to them within our thoughts, "The renovation project is permanently over. You do not need to be fixed, you do not need to be optimized, and you do not need to change a single line of your face to sit at this table. You are home, exactly as you are." We feel a magnificent, explosive current of relief rushing through our chest as the war against our own shadow finally grinds to a halt. Realizing that true wholeness is not the absence of a flaw, but the boundless capacity to love ourselves in the very middle of the mess. This inner reconciliation opens the gateway for our third and most revolutionary discipline, the active cultivation of radical inhabitation. This is the art of immediate expression, the practice of training our nervous system to launch the business, speak the unpolished truth, or fully commit to a relationship while the anxiety is humming in our chest, completely abandoning the illusion that we must wait for a sanitized existence before we are allowed to act. We begin to practice this sovereignty by intentionally entering the arenas of our lives, where we have previously practiced the high-level hiding of perpetual preparation. If we have been withholding a creative project because we believe it isn't mathematically perfect, we open the file this very afternoon, we refuse to run it through another round of analytical optimization, and we release it into the world with all its raw, irregular textures fully visible. If we are in a relationship where we have been maintaining an icy hyper-vigilant distance to protect our unhealed wounds, we drop the safety testing, we unlock our diaphragm, we look our partner directly in the eyes, and we speak a word of terrifying, unscripted vulnerability right through the center of our shaking breath. We do not wait for the fear to vanish before we move with the fear, allowing the anxiety to rattle through our ribcage like a passing thunderstorm, while our spine remains straight, light, and completely unmovable in its own self-authority. We treat our imperfections not as structural failures that disqualify us from life, but as the beautiful, unique brushstrokes that give our human journey its deep, authentic soul. By practicing this immediate habitation, the chronic paralysis that has kept us freezing in the basement completely evaporates. We discover that we do not need to seek a final permission slip from a therapeutic rainbow that does not exist. Our own raw, unpolished presence is its own baseline, its own temple, and its own complete fulfillment. We step onto the damp earth not as an eternal patient waiting for a cure, but as a fully awakened sovereign who has chosen to throw a magnificent feast right in the very center of their beautifully cracked, unfinished, and lived reality. When we finally abandon the fantasy of the finished self and step out of the damp basement of perpetual repair, an extraordinary, breathtaking stillness descends across the entire parameters of our living reality. This stillness is not the hollow, artificial quiet of a sterilized laboratory or the rigid numbness of a mind that has finally succeeded in policing its flaws. It is the vibrant, fragrant, and utterly unshakable peace of a historic estate that has chosen to embrace its own, weathering a radical state of presence that requires zero optimization to confirm its absolute completeness. The heavy, dry ache of insufficiency that has spent years humming like cold air behind our sternum dissolves into a spacious, luminous warmth. We look around the immediate terrain of our current life, and for the first time since we entered the therapeutic panopticon, we are fully, ecstatically there to inhabit the space we occupy, completely free from the toxic compulsion to audit our current alignment against a clinical blueprint. The physical world rushes back into our awareness with an exquisite, unshielded intensity that reveals our old, non-stop psychological renovations to be nothing but bloodless, digital illusions. The The texture of the raw daylight hitting the wall feels remarkably dense and alive, illuminating the uneven plaster, the scuffs on the floorboards, and the beautiful, irregular geography of our ordinary room. The sound of our own unoptimized breathing, the cluttered stack of journals on the desk, or the sudden, erratic flare of a passing emotion are no longer treated as structural defects to be pathologized and cured, but as the magnificent, spontaneous currents of a life stream that is too vast to be contained by a diagnostic manual. When we sit at our desks or look into the mirror, we can see our own reflection straight ahead without any internal pull toward a hypothetical future version of ourselves, completely liberated from the exhausting mandate to remain an eternal patient waiting for a cure. Our physical body rests deeply in this newly reclaimed territory. Our throat is completely open. Our ribcage expands sideways with a wild animal freedom, and our weight drops effortlessly into the solid center of our pelvis, moving like a slow tide that has finally given up on the madness of trying to flatten its own waves. This is the state of radical inhabitation, the deep somatic realization that your actual, flawed, and beautifully unfinished life is not a technical rehearsal or a state of deficit, but the supreme and ultimate palace of your awakening. We have returned to the single sovereign coordinate of our raw human nature. We have stopped demanding that the universe sanitize our psyche before we are allowed to touch the world, and we have allowed ourselves to discover the immense, rich flavor of the life stream running through our veins right now. We see that when we cut away the plastic tarps of perpetual preparation, we are not losing our potential. We are allowing the deep sap of our consciousness to flow with maximum velocity into the one path beneath our feet, launching the business, speaking the unpolished truth, and surrendering to love while the dust is still falling in the hallways. We can close the self, we can lay down our diagnostic labels, and we can look at an ordinary, anxious Thursday evening with a sense of quiet, unshakable dignity, knowing that this cracked, asymmetrical reality is enough. In the beautiful, uncompromising literature of the deep insight tradition, the Buddha continuously points away from the frantic cravings of the perfectionist ego which seeks to possess a flawless, disembodied timeline and attach itself to a phantom of purity, and directs our focus toward the precise, unyielding truth of the earth exactly as it is. He reminded his followers that liberation is never found by trying to build an endless fortress out of imaginary options, but by completely penetrating the immediate reality of where your feet are currently planted. He invited us to look beyond the glittering mirages of our optimized futures, to put down the heavy second arrow of our psychological regrets, and to find the deep, unconditioned peace that exists when we finally stop treating our personality as a broken machine. The morning sun outside our window has risen completely now, washing the room in a deep, golden light that catches the fine white powder of our unpainted walls, turning the air into a shimmering, luminous field of gold. The modern world outside will continue to flash its neon signs of infinite upgrade, trying to seduce us back into the torment of continuous correction and hyper-vigilant repair. But the ghostly spell of the blueprint has been completely broken. We have turned our neck straight ahead. We have allowed our alternative, sanitized futures to dissolve back into the open sky, and we are finally ready to throw open the heavy wooden doors of our estate, lighting a roaring fire in the hearth to host a magnificent feast in the very center of our beautifully cracked reality. If you finally accepted that the renovation project will never be completed, if you dropped the second arrow of self-pathology and threw open the doors to host a magnificent feast right now, in the very middle of your beautifully cracked and human life, who would you be in this very unshielded second?